Hello, welcome. My name is Dr. Andresen. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist at the NeuroDiagnostic Institute and Advanced Treatment Center, which we call the NDI. And I'm here to do the second installment of our Mind Matters webinar series, which is all about trauma-informed care. All right, so our presentation obviously is going to discuss trauma. If you become emotionally affected by the content of anything that I say while I'm doing this presentation, please take a break and return when you feel ready. If you're in Indiana and you need help or you want to talk to somebody, you can always call the Be Well Crisis Helpline by dialing 211 from any phone. And they have counselors all of the time. But if you need immediate help, then always call 911 or go to your nearest emergency department. Okay, so before we talk about trauma-informed care, we need to talk about trauma. There are 3 E's in trauma, which my definition here covers all of them. So trauma can be defined as resulting from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the person's functioning and mental, physical, social, and/or spiritual well-being. So that's a lot. But basically, something happens, the person experiences it as terrifying, and that has an impact on their functioning moving forward. Another way we can look at trauma is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So if I get assaulted and I feel awful afterwards, that makes sense. That it's a normal reaction to a terrible situation. If a child is neglected and they only get attention when they yell or hit or scream or otherwise act out, the child's probably going to yell or scream or act out because that's the only way they know to get that attention. These are normal, understandable reactions to terrible situations. So there are obviously many traumatic events, and they can be broken down broadly into the categories of abuse, loss, and chronic stress. Potentially traumatic events often include a threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. And we can have acute traumas, so something like a parent dies or my house burns down, one event that's terrible. Or you can have complex trauma where you have multiple events over time that are traumatic. So this might be something like going to war. It might be something like growing up in an abusive household where there's a long period of time where traumatic events happen. So if you are interested or have learned about trauma much at all, you may have heard of the term ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. ACEs are a public health way of looking at trauma, and it is 10 categories of terrible things that happen to children sometimes that the field has kind of taken up as an easy way to think about trauma. It's important to know that ACEs do not represent an exhaustive list of all of the kinds of trauma that we can have. So ACEs include things like mental illness in the family, parental divorce or separation, incarceration of a family member, substance abuse or neglect or abuse of the child themselves. It doesn't include things like chronic illness, which we know can be traumatic. It doesn't include bullying. It doesn't include just assault or car accidents. So there's lots of other stuff that is potentially traumatic that isn't covered by ACEs, but it is kind of an easy shorthand to use. It's a good place to start. The ACEs model was developed in the late 90s, and more recently, it has been recognized that it's a very incomplete model. So in addition to the adverse childhood experiences, they added a second level to the ACEs model, and now it's called the pair of ACEs. And the second level is adverse community environments. So this recognizes that these adverse events do not happen in isolation. It's not just a problem in that family or that household or whatever. These things come from somewhere, and oftentimes they come from the community not being a healthy community for whatever reason. So it might just be that there's a lot of poverty, or it's a violent neighborhood, or there's just no economic mobility for the family. And all of these things obviously complicate everything. And the more adverse community environments, the more factors you have that make your community environment challenging, the more likely you are to experience ACEs. But when we are talking about ACEs, generally when you hear about ACEs, they're speaking about adverse childhood experiences, or those traumas that happen to individual people. So how prevalent are ACEs? And again, keep in mind that ACEs are not all the kinds of trauma by any means at all. It's a very incomplete list of traumas, but it is, again, a good place to start. So the ACEs, again, were developed, the ACEs model was developed in the 90s, and they did a really excellent study looking at the prevalence of ACEs at the time. And this study had over 17,000 participants, which is pretty impressive. But really, it's a best case scenario sample. So like if you live a very privileged, lucky life, this is a good sample for you. So of these 17,000 participants, 75% of them were white, and 75% of them had gone to college. And all of them had good jobs, and all of them had good health care. So that is very clearly not a representative sample of the United States or anywhere else in the world for that matter. It's, again, a very privileged section of our population. That said, looking at the numbers, it's a little bit shocking. So even in this very sort of as stable as you get kind of a population, we have almost 30% of them reporting having been physically abused as children. 10 to 15% of them reported experiencing neglect. Substance abuse was present in over a quarter of the households. About a quarter of the households had divorce or separation in the family. So ACEs are still very common even in this kind of situation. And in fact, over 60% of adults in this study reported experiencing at least one ACE or at least one of these traumatic events. And those numbers are still pretty true today. More current studies find about 60% of adults report having experienced at least one ACE. The 90s was a long time ago, although it doesn't feel that way. So I thought I would look up some new numbers. And it turns out that in 2021, although only 37% of marriages end in divorce, that impacts 1 out of 2 kids. So literally half of our children in this country are impacted by divorce or separation of their parents. In 2019, the American Psychological Association completed a survey, again, of the United States, looking at how many households sought mental health treatment. And in 2019, 48% of households were seeking some sort of mental health treatment. Obviously, the pandemic has happened since then, and things have changed a lot, and the pandemic has clearly not been good for anybody's mental health. So it would not surprise me if these numbers are even higher nowadays. So that tells me that about half, at least half of American households are trying to cope with mental illness somewhere in the family. And then finally, incarceration, 5% down there. This was the one that surprised me the most. Recent numbers from, again, this year found that 45% of Americans who were surveyed reported having had a family member be incarcerated. So incarceration could be anywhere from 24 hours all the way through sentence to life. But almost half of Americans have had a family member incarcerated at some point. That is shocking to me. And of course, that is not static across all the different demographics. In this survey, again, 63% of Black people reported having had a family member incarcerated, and only 42% of white people reported the same. And that is probably not surprising, and it is also consistent with generally looking at trauma and ACEs. So if you are a woman or if you are a minority of any kind at all, for whatever reason, you are at increased risk for experiencing ACEs and other forms of trauma. Whether an event is experienced as traumatic depends on a variety of things, many of which are listed right here. And I think it's interesting that an event is more likely to be experienced as traumatic if it's an interpersonal event. So if I am walking down the street and I get assaulted, I'm more likely to have a trauma reaction to that than if I'm in a car crash or if I live through an earthquake. And that's not to say that car crashes or natural disasters are not traumatic or can't be traumatic, because they absolutely can. But statistically, you are more likely to have a trauma reaction when it's an interpersonal event as opposed to a natural disaster or an act of God kind of thing. So trauma obviously has many different effects, and these effects can be made worse by humiliation, betrayal, blaming the victim, or silencing. And in fact, the effects of these traumas might even be unrecognized. So let's say that you didn't have enough food when you were a toddler, and for whatever reason, after you were 4 years old, there was enough food, and you've had enough food ever since then. Perhaps as an adult, you hoard food, or you always have more food than other people think is reasonable, or perhaps you binge eat. Even though you don't consciously remember not having had enough food as a child, that experience, that trauma might be where that behavior originated. It might be because of the trauma that you're doing these things nowadays. And you don't have to be able to remember the event itself in order for it to impact your behavior. And really, trauma can impact basically every single aspect of being a human, including the way our bodies and brains function and develop. So here is an example of that. These are two brains of 3-year-old children. These kids are exactly the same age. Over here on the left, we have, these are CT scans, which is basically an X-ray of the brain. Over here, we have a typically developing brain. This white part is the skull. And on the inside here, this gray stuff is the brain tissue. And then the dark parts in the middle are fluid-filled spaces in the brain called ventricles that are normal and meant to be there. So then we look at this brain on the right, which is labeled extreme neglect. And the first thing you notice is that this skull is tiny. It looks literally about half as big as it should compared to this other kid who's, again, the same age. And then even when you look inside this tiny skull, these ventricles, these fluid-filled spaces in the brain, are bigger in this tiny brain than they are in this typically developing brain. So what that tells me is that there's even less brain tissue inside this skull than you would expect based on the tiny size. So whatever this child went through was so severe that their brain literally could not grow. It could not grow the neurons that most people grow as part of normal development. Obviously, that doesn't happen all of the time, thankfully, although it does unfortunately happen. Most of the time, even if we experience terrible, terrible things, our brains grow to the appropriate size or the typical size. But just because it's the right size doesn't mean that it's hooked up right. So this is a different way of looking at the brain. This is a PET scan, which is a scan of the activity of the brain. In PET scans, warm colors mean there's more activity, and cool colors mean there's less activity. These are school-age children. And inside these circles are parts of the frontal lobes and parts of the temporal lobes. And these parts of the brains do sort of emotional and behavioral management, among other things. So when we're looking in this typically developing brain, we see a lot of nice warm colors, lots of activity in these circles. And then this brain over here is the brain of a child who grew up in a Romanian orphanage. And Eastern European orphanages, if you are unfamiliar with them, are very challenging places to grow up or to work, I'm sure. They are often severely underfunded. They are absolutely severely understaffed. So they are caring for many, many children with very few staff. And so what they are able to do is keep the kids alive, and that's kind of it. Oftentimes kids are locked in cribs. Kids are changed or fed on a schedule and not when they need to be. If they cry, they cry. There's nobody there to comfort them. There just aren't enough people. So it's a place of, it's not physical neglect, but it is emotional and social neglect. Again, just because they don't have any other options in those areas. So looking at the brain of this child, inside my circles here, we see what look like black holes. This child, because of the emotional deprivation when they were very young, their brains literally never hooked up the way you would expect them to. This child never was able to develop coping strategies other than something went wrong, I need to cry. That's all their brain is capable of doing. And so the things that we experience, especially when we're very young, have a profound impact on the way our brain develops. So there are obviously a variety of signs of trauma. As you are reading through these, which I'm breaking down into categories of behavioral, emotional, and physical, and cognitive, you may notice that a lot of these signs of trauma are also symptoms of psychological disorders. For example, you might notice some things that look like PTSD. You might notice things that look like depression. We could see things like anxiety. And we can see disruptive behavior. A lot of our signs of trauma are also signs of various psychological disorders, which I think makes sense. If you experience a trauma, I think what most of us would expect is that you would have some sort of emotional reaction to that. So that tracks. That ACEs study, again, that was done in the late 90s, looked at the impact of ACEs on later functioning. And they found that the more ACEs you've experienced, the more at risk you are for poor outcomes. So they found that if you have 4 or more ACEs, you are 6 times more likely to have had sex before you turn 15. You are 5 times more likely to experience hallucinations. And you are 12 times as likely to attempt suicide. All of that is awful. but again, not completely unexpected. But having experienced ACEs also has a big impact on your behavior and your health. So if you experience 4 or more ACEs, you are at significantly increased risk of substance use disorders, and you are at significantly increased risk for chronic health problems like heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, diabetes. And in fact, at least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death in this country are associated with ACEs. And I think this slide really illustrates that strikingly. So in this study, if you experienced 0 ACEs, your life expectancy was 80 years. But people who had experienced 6 or more ACEs had a life expectancy of 60 years. So this trauma has a profound effect on every aspect of functioning, including your actual physical body. So here are a few more statistics on trauma in children. Mostly what I want you to take from this is that it's very common. Up to 93% of youth entering our juvenile justice system have experienced trauma. Up to 80% of school-age children are bullied. 71% of children are exposed to violence every year. So this is, it's a big deal. And then in adults, we see similar pictures. I want to highlight these last 3 points here. Up to 98% of people with a serious mental illness or an SMI have histories of trauma. And up to 42% of people with serious mental illness also suffer from PTSD. So they have something like schizophrenia, and they also have PTSD. And then finally, 2/3 of individuals who have a substance use disorder have experienced trauma. All right, so that is an awful lot about trauma. What about trauma-informed care? Theoretically, what I'm supposed to be talking about today. So here in the state hospital system, we see people with chronic, severe, serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Before you learned about all of these trauma statistics, you might wonder, why do we need trauma-informed care for these patients? Isn't the regular care good enough? Well, hopefully after that last slide in particular, you realize that we need to assume that every single person who's being treated, and more safely, every single person in the world has experienced some sort of trauma. And some of the symptoms of their mental illnesses are a result of that trauma. So again, remember, 98% of people with a serious mental illness have been traumatized, and 42% of them also have PTSD. So if we are neglecting trauma, if we are not taking trauma into account as we work with these patients, then we are missing a huge part of what brought their mental illnesses on and what we can do to help them get through it. So if we're not trauma-informed, then people don't know about how prevalent trauma is. The behavior that people are doing might be seen as intentionally provocative. They're doing these things to us on purpose. The focus on the units is on rule enforcement and compliance. Patients are often labeled as manipulative, needy, attention-seeking, staff-splitting, and the question among the staff and on the units is often, what's wrong with you? Why can't you make better choices? We're giving you these opportunities. What's wrong? But if we shift our perspective to trauma-informed care, then it helps us understand these extreme behaviors as the only way that our patients know how to cope. It's the only thing their brains have allowed them to, the only things they've been able to learn and the only things their brain know how to do. These extreme behaviors also are their way of connecting, and they're the way of communicating how they feel and what's going on inside them. Because again, they literally do not have the ability to do other things in many cases. Trauma-informed care moves away from that question of what's wrong with you to the question of what happened to you. What have you been through in your life that has brought you to this place? What has caused you to have these symptoms? Trauma-informed care also recognizes that coercive environments are re-traumatizing, and it tries to equalize power across patients and staff, among other things. And it recognizes that treatment should be collaborative, empowering, and strengths-based instead of only focusing on what's wrong. And then finally, trauma-informed care tells us that healing happens in relationships, and it happens in relationships across the board, whether you're a psychiatrist or a nurse or a tech, any relationship can be healing. Trauma-informed care has 4 R's, and these apply to organizations that are doing trauma-informed care as well as the individual people in them. So trauma-informed care realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs of symptoms of trauma in clients, in families, in staff, and in every single person involved with the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and it actively resists re-traumatizing our patients and our staff. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, has 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach. The first one is safety. Everybody in the organization should feel safe. Every single person. If you're working for the organization, if you're being served by the organization, everybody needs to feel safe. The second one is trust. The organization should work transparently to build and maintain trust among everybody. And again, everybody means everybody at every level of care and of employment. The third one is peer support. Patients should be given the opportunity to have relationships with people who have been there before. So I think the best example that I know of peer support comes from the substance use recovery communities. So things like sponsors and 12-step programs or peer recovery coaches in the substance use community. Those are really excellent examples of peer support. People who have been there before, who know exactly how you're feeling, helping you get through it, and helping one another. Actually, it's a reciprocal relationship where they help each other. The fourth one is collaboration and mutuality. This one strives to level power differentials across the board. So not just the patient-staff power differential, but also the power difference between the administration and direct care. This principle also tells us that the patient is the expert on themselves. They know themselves the best. And this is also where healing happens in relationships. And it tells us that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. Again, any relationship can help people heal. Number 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice. This one tells us that we should remain strengths focused and the client should have choices in their treatment. And it tells us that people are resilient. They can get better. And then finally, we have number 6 of cultural, historical, and gender issues. This one recognizes the role that society has played in the traumatization of large swaths of our population, unfortunately. Recognizes the historical trauma and the role that that plays in current trauma histories. It also has us move as organizations and individuals past the stereotypes, and it reminds us to use the patient's own culture to help them heal and to make sure they have the support that they need in a way that makes sense for them in their culture once they are out of, if it's a significant disruption to life like being in a state hospital, once they're back in the community. All right, so that is a lot, and I know that, but overall, these are 5 points I want you to take away. I'm going to highlight number 1 and number 5. The first one is that trauma is incredibly common. It is safer to assume that every single person you ever meet has experienced some sort of trauma because you will be less often wrong if you assume that they've been traumatized, because, again, most people have been, unfortunately. And then the 5th one is trauma-informed care looks at people and asks what has happened to you, what brought you to this place, rather than what's wrong with you, why are you doing this? And I think this is a good perspective to keep, again, with everybody that you're working with, especially if you're working with young kids, for example, whether you're a teacher or just have kids of your own, a babysitter. What has caused you to do this, as opposed to what's wrong with you, is a good way of helping you shift perspective in your own brain and help figure out solutions, as opposed to just focusing on problems. So overall, trauma-informed care sees symptoms and problem behaviors as a natural result of trauma, and it tries to work with people in a genuine, open, caring, mutual, and empowering way. All right, so that is what I have. I'm going to leave up the references slide here in case anybody's interested in that, and I am happy to take any questions. Let's see, we have a question here of, you have been discussing a lot of the effects of trauma when it occurs in children, but does trauma have a pervasive, long-lasting effect on the brain if it happens in adulthood, or is the effect more profound in childhood? That's a good question. The trauma can have an impact on your brain no matter what age you are when you experience your trauma, but it does have a more profound effect when you are a child. Most of your brain development happens before you turn 5, and so if you experience traumatic events when you are in that early developmental period, that sort of changes the fundamental principles that your brain builds itself around, if that makes sense. It's laying the foundation for the rest of your life. And if the foundation is a little bit warped, then your brain is just kind of going to be a little bit warped. You're going to see the world a little bit differently. So if you are neglected as a young child, and one of the earliest lessons you learn is nobody's there for me, I have to take care of myself, then it's going to be really hard to change that moving forward. But on the same stripe, if you are an adult and you experience a traumatic event, that also changes your brain. Yes. Hopefully I answered that one. Here's another one. As a teacher, I'm already thinking about how much sense this makes with some of my students, and now you have me thinking about the potential prevalence of trauma with all my students. I'm thinking about how I can utilize this information to better engage with my class. Do you have any resources that might further my understanding of how to adapt this model to a school or a classroom setting? That's a really great question. And it turns out that trauma-informed schools and trauma-informed teaching is absolutely a thing. If you Google those kinds of things on the internet, you can find trainings about how to have a trauma-informed school or how to take a trauma-informed approach in your own classroom. There's also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is nctsn.org, National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And there are some very helpful references for people at rems.ed.gov. That is the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools, rems.ed.gov. Okay, let's see. So I just Googled the ACE test while listening, and I may have a score above 6. What does this mean for me? Is my fate sealed? What can I do? If your ACE score is above 6, I am very sorry. That sounds like you've been through a lot. And what it means is that you are at risk for negative outcomes. It does not mean that you are going to have negative outcomes. It just means that you are at increased risk. So the recommendations for this would be pretty much the recommendations you get for everything all the time, of just sort of keep an eye on your health, keep an eye on your mental health, see your doctor regularly. Make sure you maintain good support systems and you are doing good self-care. All of those things will mitigate risk. Healing happens in relationships, and again, that's any relationship anywhere. So if you have good family connections, good social connections, good work connections, then all of that can help mitigate your risk and help you, and hopefully have you live your life just like someone who doesn't have any ACEs. Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful. And we will be back with our third installment of this Mind Matters series in a couple of weeks, I believe.